So I think that leads nicely on to one piece of advice, really, that you'd give someone starting their property development project or journey. What would be the one piece of advice you would give someone new starting out?
Something new, they just didn't expect what is coming. But I would always encourage to research in the market. I think it's good to understand the local market property, demand and trends. I think it gives you an idea of what type of property you would like to purchase and how much you get in terms of its return on investment. I've always encouraged my property investors or property developers to go for a property that has good transport links, because of nowadays it seems like the local authority are encouraging people to not drive but take public transport. There's a common theme where HMO properties are located near the train station or near a bus station, 15-20 minute walk. So I think it's gold. That's like gold itself to find a property that has a good transport links, or there's good amenities such as shops, restaurants as well. And that's quite a common theme. It's quite competitive as well. If you go to auction events where there'll be a certain property, there'll be a shop that has properties above that would actually sell out very quickly because of the value itself, for it to be, has its potential to get a tenant straight away because of work locations or in terms of transportation links. I've always mentioned about having a clear budget and contingency plan. I feel like nowadays with tight, we've got difficulty times this year in terms of budget. Always set a realistic budget that includes not just construction costs, but also fees for, architects, consultants, legal expenses, or any unforeseen issues, such as having some kind of insurance to cover yourself up. It'd be good, and I've always encouraged, clients as well as my builders that I work with to have a contingency cost, because without a contingency fund, then there's nothing to cover. So who's responsible for covering that? If you look in terms of how contracts have always worked within construction, there's always an encouragement to use some form of contingency fund to make sure if anything goes wrong, that could actually use those fees to cover any unexpected issues during the construction process. And as well, we just mentioned before about working in a strong team. I think it's good to surround yourself with experienced professionals in this, because that way you could get a good indication of what you can achieve from them, from their experience and what they actually build upon, given what they can actually deliver on site because there are people that have experience, but it depends on the budget. If you want to get very good people to work on any particular good project, it's all about their fees, it's all about their expertise to help you to build a very good portfolio of HMO and flat conversion projects. I think those three ideas in terms of prioritizing through due diligence and planning is to make sure that would actually minimize risks, especially starting out in property development, because that would give you a likely chance of some form of success in doing this by planning, by being due diligent, being aware about these issues regarding costs, and be aware about who you're working with in terms of the profession. The construction industry is quite a complicated industry in terms of finding the right contractor with experience. There are some contractors that are quite inexperienced, don't know what they're doing. They might have the insurance, they might have public liability insurance or professional indemnity insurance, but there are some that don't want to work to a high standard of quality work. I've come across a few bad ones, there's some good ones, but at the end of the day you have to do so much due diligence to find the right people to help you to achieve your success if you're going to do property developing for the first time.
I think you're absolutely right about the budget part. Quite often there's so many unforeseens, and you do obviously have to find the money to complete those projects. So putting that in your budget initially, putting in that contingency within your budget initially is really key to make sure that you can actually complete and finish your project to the standard that you want to achieve. So yeah, which brings me on nicely while we're talking about money, as we do obviously as part of our property investment journey.
Yeah.
How do architects normally or typically charge for their services, and what should property investors budget for? So I don't know if there's a typical project almost and some example pricing or fees which you might be able to share. Might be a range of fees, to be fair, Ken, which might just give us a flavour of the costs involved for, like I said, an architectural designer or an architect.
Yeah, I think there's many ways of being charged for a particular fee. I think it just depends on the type of project you're working on. Normally, I could actually relate to, there's 6 ways of charging fees on it. I can give you a brief on it. The most common method is the percentage of construction costs. That's the first one, which is like the architect's fee is based upon the total construction cost. So the percentage tends to be around 5 to 10%, depending on the project complexity and location and the architect's experience. So that could be like, it depends on the theme itself and how it's calculated at the start. I think it just depends for that. It depends on the type of complexity that could actually ensure if the property investor wants to go through that route. You could go for a typical HMO flat conversion development. You could actually go around 8 to 12%, but it depends on the construction cost overall for their services. So that's the common theme that's quite normally used when it comes to construction cost of the percentage. And now the second one, another common theme was fixed fee, because sometimes some architects or designers do offer a fixed fee for their services, particularly for well-defined projects and with a clear scope of timetable. So that depends on the experience of the architect's work with a particular. If there's a project that could say, okay, I'm well recognized with this project, then that's where the fixed fee comes in, because they know what they're doing, they know what their outcome is, and depends on the scope of works as well, depending on which particular stage they're involved in. So you're looking in terms of, this could be an advantage for a property investor to look at the way the fixed fee can be agreed upon between both parties, and it's based on the scope of work involved in it as well. It does vary, because it does depend on the very experience of the architect. I could roughly say it depends on depends on how big or small the project is. You're looking at around 1,000 to 5,000, or you're looking around 50K. But it does depend on the type of project you're working on. If it's going to be in London, that's where you're looking at it. If it's outside London, you're looking at less. It does depend on the scope of work involved. So a fixed fee is based on the experience of the architect or designer's way of knowing what you expect in a particular project. The third one is hourly rates. There are some architects or designers do charge an hourly rate. I think it's just, again, it depends on the type of project. I think it's more commonly used in smaller projects and the scope of works. It does depend on how much work is involved. You're looking at rate-wise. The thing is with these rates, it does vary, depends on the experience of work. You're looking at senior architects charge like £100 an hour, £200 an hour, but you're looking at graduates, or, it varies. You're looking at £50 an hour, but it depends on your experience and your way of your business has been operating for specific years. I would encourage property investors to look into their hourly rates and look at how they can offer. I think you need to be very conscious about time management, because if you're going to involve a lot of amendments or change of layout ideas, sometimes architects may not charge as part of their fee in terms of making changes in floor plans, but some do, some don't. But it depends on what they want to achieve at the end of the day. Another way of charging a fee is based on cost per square meter. So some architects do charge based on the total square footage or square meterage. So I think it depends on how the space is designed. So you're looking at in terms of internal alterations or how an extension is being built up or a loft conversion. I feel like it's based upon what type of building it is. If it's commercial, it could be more. If it's residential, it could be less. But it does vary. From what I've researched, is looking at around 5 to 20 per square meter. Or, depending on the type of architect you're working, you're looking at 200 per square meter, but it just depends on the type of property, the type of architect you're working for. The next one is a retainer fee, which is like a deposit fee. So an architect or designer will request a deposit up front to keep as a holding fee at the start of the project work, if there's something that needs to be done and needs to be completed. But then that way, once the work is completed, you pay the remaining amount. So that's a retainer fee sort of things, like making sure it depends on the type of percentage fee that is involved. It's normally around 10 to 15%. But it depends on the longevity of the project, how much work is involved. Sometimes people request 50% up front, depends on the agreed fixed fee of the project itself, but depends on how it's being completed during those stages. If there's delays, then the fee might be released. But then again, that's based upon, the agreed scope of works and also the contract negotiation between the architect and the client. And then finally, you talk about phased payments. So phased payments is where arranged for architectural services that is typically structured in phases and payments due to specific milestones. So for example, the eight stages I've explained earlier, that could be based upon that. So you got your initial discussion, you got your fee paid for that, concept design paid for that, and then you got your design development, you got your construction development. So those stages come in. But I think how you negotiate with the cost itself in that time frame. But what property investors should look out for, I think, is also one of the things is making sure they do research and discuss with individuals that could actually offer these services. So you're looking at, feasibility study, initial consultation. What I've gathered and I've heard from my friends who are also, architects and designers, they are trying to make sure they get a fee applied to consultation. You're looking at 50 quid for a consultation, but depending on the experience, you're looking at $1,000 or $2,000. And then you're looking in terms of concept and design development, research into how much they charge in terms of their budgets. It does depend on how much time the architect spends on redefining the design. Again, it just depends on the fixed fee agreement. It depends on the percentage as well. You're looking at 5 to 10% again. In terms of planning approval and construction documentation, it does vary. Depends on how much documentation is required and the experience of the architect. So you're looking at, for planning approval, you're looking at minimum between £1,000 to £5,000, but it does depend on the architect. So these figures are not really realistic figures, just figures that architects tend to charge, but depending on their experience and their status and their expertise as well. You could get people less than £1,000, but it just really depends on who you work with and the person you're working with, making sure they've got the experience and they know what they're doing, getting work done on time. So that could vary based on experience. As far as construction is concerned, again, going back to the percentage of the construction fee, 5 to 10%, you just don't know how much work is going to be involved. That's where most architects are more comfortable with, because the 5 to 10% percentage construction fee comes with everything included, but it depends on the overall budget from the property investor's point of view. And also as well, there's sometimes project management. It does depend on the architect who's interested in project managing. If not, you have architecture designers or technicians or even people who are contractors can do project management, but depending upon the overall fee. So it's always ideal for property investors to look into the budget and how much they can afford. Maybe the feedback would be good to look into their feedback. It would be good to maybe consider, specialist consultants. So you look at specialist consultants as structural engineers or M&E specialists that could actually add overall costs. I feel like as well, I think it's always nice to just ensure that you give something to the local people. There are some property investors don't like to work with. I think it's just to save travel costs, to save excessive costs. If you're going to be in traffic all the time, you're traveling from, so like you've got a project in Liverpool, but you've got someone that you can come to work with in Manchester. You just don't know in terms of how stressful it is to, commute from Liverpool to Manchester or vice versa. Ideally, it'd be nice to just give someone local the job to do. It will save, travel costs. It will save time. It will give some kind of opportunity for the local people to do something within your own property investment. Those are the things that could actually help people to ensure that work can go through smoothly. But, I think when it comes to budgeting and making sure everything's kept under control, you have to make sure you have a clear scope and budget, making sure that the architect or designer, interior designer, or anyone involved get your idea from the start. Making sure there's limit changes, because the more changes you make, the more it will generate more costs. So make sure you have a realistic outcome in terms of limiting the number of changes you have in a property. I would consider phased payments, because if you pay everything up front, you're not going to get anything back. I think I always work with clients to make sure there's phased payment plans, making sure once each task is completed. Some clients like this idea of making sure a task is completed, making sure I inspect the works, making sure everything's done up to high standards, and then payments issued to the contractor at each intervals, because you want to make sure you're getting the right money for this in terms of who you're working with, because it does limit the cost and how much you're spending. Also, always compare quotes as well. And when it comes to tendering, when it comes to finding the right consultant or specialist, I know architects don't like this, because what they tend to do, they'll speak to one person, they'll go to another person, they'll go to different platforms or websites or, social media. They want to see where they can find the cheapest quote. I think that's the main issue. If you look in terms of the criteria, not quality. From my experience, people would choose someone who's the cheapest rather than the quality. You just don't know what's the outcome when you choose the cheapest builder or architect or consultant. But always compare the quotes based on quality and cost, because people always compare, no matter who you are, based on the cost. They always go with the cheapest, and it always ended up in a disaster. So always compare based on feedback, cost, and quality in terms of the portfolio, in terms of what they do, on their knowledge and understanding of the works. I think that way, that would give you some kind of safe comfort that how architects and designers charge their services, and then it will enable you to budget for each stage of the project. And I feel like property investors should be ensured that they can manage the cost effectively while achieving their desired results, because what you don't want to do is invest into something that you don't have faith in. You want to make sure you have self-assurance with that person who's going to help you to achieve your goals and expectations in property investment. And the issue we have in the construction industry, we do have, and I feel like, I don't know if there's some issue when it comes to regulations in terms of a particular contractor you're working with. There is a huge issue where you're going to choose someone that you like. Oh, I like this person based on how they work, and then based on their feedback, I like the fact that they work for people. And then when it comes to the snagging stages, when it comes to the inspection of works, it's not done to high quality. So those things is something that you have to make sure that you seek their feedback, make sure they work with the right people. If they are very good with their knowledge, if they can actually compromise something on site, there are some contractors that could just, if there's an issue, they can resolve it within minutes. But there's some inexperienced builders that can't resolve within minutes, that could take their time, they can't do it, they tend to charge extra. So making sure in terms of their research into their budgeting, they choose the people that know what they're doing, choose the people based on their feedback, choose quality over quantity of their feedback. So that's what I would give warning to any particular property investor that want to get into the property business, because you could easily lose money instantly and you won't never get it back if you're going to not be aware about those circumstances, because people can lose money instantly. You have to be a shrewd individual to be conscious about who you're working with, making sure this person knows what they're doing. I've seen people lost so much money through property development and other forms of residential development in the last couple of years now, and people weren't so happy about being scammed or being, hoodwinked by people that don't know what they're doing and they just can't give something in return. So yeah, this is what I would actually ensure people to make sure they choose the right individuals for your project.
Yeah, certainly we see that a lot. You hear the horror stories when you're speaking to other investors.
Yeah.
Projects which have gone wrong, overrun, costs obviously spiraling. Yeah, there's many challenges which you have to navigate as a property investor, and having, like I said, an architect designer or an architect who you're working with is key. And you never know, if you give a local person an opportunity, that they might just come really good for you. But again, it is back due diligence. Make sure you check out their background, what they're all about, potentially look at previous work they've done, speak to people they've worked with to make sure that you're working with someone who's good and knows what they're doing and can add value to the project. So which brings us on nicely to trends and innovation. Obviously, technology is key in every industry now.
Yeah.
But in terms of the 3D modeling or virtual reality, how is technology helping architects to work more efficiently and effectively to improve the outcomes for property investors?
Yeah, it's an interesting trend now that we have BIM, which is actually being heavily used nowadays in terms of helping us to not only construct but give us a good cost idea of how much you can actually spend on. It seems like it's another way to, I feel like with technology nowadays implemented in property development that are shaping architecture design itself, I think it can influence itself from technology that has issues in construction. It'll be interesting to know how, because I think BIM itself, that's the only thing that I've been heavily used upon, how it can help us to give us indication of specific information that can be constructed on site, but also in terms of the technology itself being used. Yeah, I think like with BIM, BIM is heavily used, it's quite popularly used. I think people still under training with BIM. I feel that there's three key elements about using BIM in terms of improved design visualization, because you get a 3D view, well as a 2D view. But the 3D modeling shows, allows you to give you an indication of a high detail and realistic representation of a proposed building. So it does give you an idea of the visualization for the end product in terms of what is presented before construction starts. And it gives you a good idea about how the information is being communicated. So in terms of its physical and functional characteristics of the building, it does facilitate a better collaboration where you've got this component of BIM that can be shared within architects, engineers, property investors, or anyone involved in it. So it does give you a good indication of how much that could be shared. And it does reduce miscommunication, because sometimes when an architect produces plans and they send it to other people, just don't understand what the plans are laid out on. With this BIM software, it reduces confusion among everyone when you're working in a collaboration team. And of course as well, it does give you some kind of accuracy and precision when it comes to calculation of materials and the use of space and other essential elements within a building. So it does give you that detailed information in contrast to AutoCAD, which doesn't give you that much information apart from a floor plan. It does have its benefits for property investors in terms of, looking at that will highlight potential issues before construction begins. It gives you a good indication of what type of materials you're going to purchase. So it gives you cost-saving adjustments when it comes to the materials design. Because with BIM, they give you a list of specification materials. So I think that could be implemented with MBS, like a specification survey software that you choose specific materials that have specifications. That could be implemented. That could be interchangeable. Look at the cost at the process, so you could do a comparative cost with this software. It does reduce the risk of errors, which is the good thing about using BIM. Because with digital representation, there is a likelihood of miscalculations when it comes to using specific steel beams or, specific use of material, and could actually reduce delays in the process as well. And it does give you a good indication of decision making as well in terms of using BIM. It does make good decision making as well. It gives you a faster decision to make in terms of choosing any materials based on cost and based on its budget. You could actually encourage people to use BIM. I think people still, funny enough, today, as of now, people still use hand drawings, use the old architect's hand drawing board. But with technology speeding up and with the use of AI, BIM itself could actually give some kind of indication of more efficient design that would enable people to ensure what they can actually invest in terms of what they can buy. I think it's just a way to be more presentable in terms of being realistic with what type of materials you're going to purchase. It does help people to make decisions easily if it's done digitally and make it presentably clear to people if they're going to make an investment. I think BIM does have its benefits. I try to use BIM sometimes, but it depends on the individual I'm working with. If I'm working with an engineer that doesn't know how to use BIM, that could cause a bit of problems. So it does depend on the experience and knowledge of using BIM in the process.
Could you just explain what BIM is? Sorry.
BIM is BIM stands for Build Information Modeling. So it's like an innovative way to use some form of information that can, when you build information in some kind of three-dimensional component in a software, it gives you the information that could actually be calculated based upon area size, based on materials. It gives you a good indication of the cost as well. There's a feature on it where that gives you how much volume is being used. So BIM is a way that would actually, it's a program software like you use to draw up 2D, 3D drawings, but it has additional information that can be calculated using specific materials or specific specifications that would enable you to give you an indication that would actually also can help you to give you a cost indication of how much that development will go through that property itself.
Thank you, Ken. That's helped to clarify what that is. So thinking about the biggest challenges you face when working with property developers, like you said, you're across a whole host of projects at various different times. How do you overcome those challenges? And what are those challenges which you regularly maybe frustrate you even as an architect, architectural designer?
I think this biggest challenge is budget and time constraints. Time constraints is a big issue when it comes to making sure the work is being completed on time. I always want to balance my design inspirations with the budget and time constraints. So I always want to make sure that people within the property developing business to be more realistic and be more open about it in terms of what they can actually afford. Because there'll be moments where they want to design stuff that really want to do to fulfill their expectations. But when it comes to cost calculations, you bring a quantity surveyor in and calculate the costs, they'll be like, oh, that's too expensive. I can't do this. I can't use this specific material. I've always get this frustrated where, when it comes to being aware about these circumstances. But I think there's ways to overcome it. And I think it's always good to be sincere with the property investor in terms of experience that you went through in terms of when the budget goes over the top, and you have to be aware about these things in terms of what you need to tell them. So you need to have a clear communication with property developers and investors to understand their goals, their budget expectations, and making sure these deadlines are achieved sufficiently, because you just don't know how long it takes for you to remove a load-bearing wall in a building, which could be it would not complement with the cost itself, but also the time itself to remove a large load-bearing wall. So I think that's something that I always make sure that I always propose an early and open communication about the dangers of leaving things late, as well as choosing designs that are going to cost a lot of money. I always promote the idea, and when it comes to design ideas, I always have this flexibility and efficient way to show multiple ideas. Architects and architecture designers tend to have multiple ideas to make sure the property investors and, make sure they're open to new ideas. If they're so infused with one particular idea, it's not going to work because you don't know what's going to do, and it's going to be difficult to work in terms of, because there are benefits of being flexible, ensures that the design maintains its adaptability, such as budget cuts and unforeseen delays, while maintaining the original vision. The original vision is to make sure you achieve a particular layout inside that building. And I think it's all about accommodating changes in the budget as well, but you have to be realistic of what you can show. I always, and I've been doing this recently nowadays in terms of being aware about prioritizing sustainable design that would actually promote a longer term value. It is interesting because I never had the chance until recently that I've worked with a property developer that was quite conscious about how much money he's spending on. So it would be good that overcoming these issues, you can involve the use of sustainable and cost-effective design principles into the project. I know this idea of sustainability is coming to stage because sometimes people don't want to overspend certain elements, but maintaining its existing building, or it will reduce operational costs, in terms of having passive design strategies, depending on what type of materials you're going to use. There's this trend now that people are reclaiming old materials or used materials like insulation. That's something that is sustainable. Also, if there's people are selling off stuff that are not being used for ages, they can just reclaim that. So it does reduce costs based on the reuse of materials in certain property and developing or property investment stages. It would be good as well. Another way to overcome it is being balanced with your creative and practical input in terms of making sure, and also I think again going back to the idea of working with individuals that can actually be adaptable and being creative and being practical about certain things that overcome within an instant minute. I think something that could actually ensure the project remains within the budget while achieving a high quality outcome, because that way you know that you're not going to exceed the budget itself. So I've always say about budget and time as the main constraint when it comes to these issues, but if you can actually have a clear priority through communication, design and problem solving, if you have the individual that can actually problem solve within a minute or so, which is possible, it depends on the experience of the contractor or the architect, making sure everything's mainly on track. So I think it's just being realistic at the start before you're going to commence on construction work, even before you submit plans to the council or even design ideas, because people don't know. People don't know what they expect. If people, I want this done in 8 weeks, it's not going to be done in 8 weeks, it could be done in 80 weeks based on those circumstances. So yeah, you have to be really realistic with your budget and your time constraints, because, every single construction doesn't complete on time. It's always delays in the process, no matter how big or small the project is.
Yeah, and those delays can obviously be very costly, particularly on large-scale projects. So can you share an example of a project where you helped an investor turn around a difficult situation?
There was a project that I'm currently working on. It's in Earlham. Recently, the previous estate agent was working on a project with me, and he recently sold it to another property investor. And the difficulty was the fact that the new owner of that building, which got planning permission to convert an old conservative club, like a community centre that was used for people who are members of the Conservative Party, and we managed to get planning permission to make it into 7 flats, and it took about a 2-story property. The issue is the fact that the person who bought the property, and we had a meeting, and those ideas that were proposed to him, realised that the budget went over the top. It cost a lot of money to remove within the building itself, there's load-bearing walls, there's steel beams that needs to be removed. It was very problematic for him because he can't proceed. He wants to start on the project straight away in terms of construction. He found his contractor, he's found his surveyor, he's found his engineers. He looked at it, it's yeah, I've calculated the costs, it's not within my budget. So what it is this is what we've done, and the situation is the fact that I had to rework in the design. I have to rework in the design layout to simplify, but also to make sure it complies with planning. Because what we want to do is making sure that the layout is simplistic in terms of construction, making sure the existing steel beams and the load-bearing walls are maintained, and also making sure that the layout is compliant with planning approval. Making those changes to planning approval could lead to an enforcement action. So it was quite challenging in terms of reducing the area sizes within each flat, but also at the same time, it does have some kind of benefits to reduce the cost itself. That's something that we had to overcome, that particular difficult situation. And also as well, and I feel like this is something that should be encouraged within property investment, is you have a collaborative cost review, because I've requested the costs for this project because I was a bit curious about how it's calculated, because that way, because we had a surveyor on the team that looked at a detailed review of the project's cost structure, and he has to probably, and I did make sure that he told us it's a certain aspect, because when it comes to a low cost, it could actually mean a low quality in terms of the layout. So he's ensured to me that all the savings he's made for the new person in charge of this project, it will not compromise the quality, because that means the materials can be maintained, what you're proposing, and simplifying some of the custom design elements as well. So, because there's this tendency where if you're going to reduce the cost, it depends on the procurement route. So this procurement route is traditional, but sometimes at the expense of time, you have to make sure the cost and quality is being achieved, because as we mentioned before about making sure the tenant and occupants fulfill a quality lifestyle in terms of living in these properties. And I don't want my designs to be low quality. I want it high quality, but in an affordable manner for the client to use this project. So that's something that we overcome, is looking at what type of materials, what type of specifications that I need to revise on. So it does take some time, again, going back to reworking on the design and to rework on the specifications in terms of insulation, in terms of plastering, in terms of light designing, in terms of decoration, as well as into the construction element as well. In terms of better time management that also been implemented. The original idea was to start the project work last summer, but that being delayed over time. What I wanted to make sure, because the project is already starting now, is to make sure that the timeline management involves an approved inspector to make sure that we've fulfilled the fire safety regulations, to make sure there's no issues with a proposed new entrance to the building itself or plumbing issues. So yeah, all of that stuff is all about making sure that whether if it's the surveyor or the architect, have to help the property investor to make strategic decisions that put the project back on track, where the revised designs are still aligned with the investor's vision, but had to reduce costs in the process. So all of that is all about collaboration, making sure there's no issues when it comes to the construction stages itself. So before construction, there was warning signs, which was useful, but those warning signs occurred when the new property owner gave me an indication that the budget went over the top, which I didn't discuss with the previous client who owned the property. So that what gave me an indication is that the new owner of the building was able to turn around where initially seemed like a challenge and potentially unprofitable development because of the cost itself. But now looked at the costs, it looks like it's going to be successful, because he's given his final cost to not only the surveyor but to the contractor. So that's where, when it comes to collaborations, when it comes to open communication and the willingness to make those design changes based upon the budget, is quite useful. Again, it's all about being in a team, trusting each other, knowing the building, how the building works. I went through the planning stages of the building because it was quite difficult to get planning permission, to make sure people know what they're doing and what they can actually achieve in terms of the situation itself. Because sometimes the difficult situation is where the architect doesn't communicate or doesn't contribute that much, and then that could lead someone to bring someone in that could build some kind of delay to the construction process. So, there was talks about, the contractor wants to bring another architect in, but the investor said, no, we want to use you because you've been through this building, you know this building for a couple of years. It just doesn't make sense to bring someone new that had to go through the building process again. It's ideal to use you because you've lived and breathed through that building for 2 to 3 years. You've been through the planning stages. So he's well aware about what I need to do in terms of my role and what I can make those changes. So there are some ways to make sure whoever is involved in the building process, to make sure that they are willing to make those changes based on budgeting, based on cost efficiency of way to reduce the limit of the budget itself. So that's something that is quite useful to overcome those difficult situations by communication and by teamwork.
Wow, that sounds a hugely challenging project, but it sounds like also there's going to be a great outcome
Yeah.
in terms of the investor getting what they need from a financial perspective and also making sure it's compliant, as well as there's some architectural design in there, which makes it a great living space for people in the future. So yeah, like I said, it just sounds like a really exciting project to be involved with. Despite all those challenges, and I'm sure that it'll be a huge success. So, we've got last parts of our interview now.
Yeah.
So, what's one fish? What is one thing you wish more property investors knew about architecture and compliance?
I think there's the importance of early engagement with an architect or an architecture designer to navigate the regulation requirements and ensure compliance from the outset. Because I feel like when it comes to when you meet someone who got a property, like, yeah, I want to do this and that, I want to achieve multiple bedrooms and such, I've always make sure that we have to be realistic of what you can achieve, because when it comes to planning, it is difficult to get plan. I think from my experience, the planning stages is difficult than building regulations in terms of how we do property development and investment from my experience, because building regulations, all you need to know is you have to have knowledge of health and safety, such as fire regulations and making sure CDM is being achieved. Planning is the difficult part, because with the changes being made now and the high demand of housing, you have to be very, very shrewd about what you can actually achieve within a certain building. It's like making sure that there's no refusals in the process, because I've worked with people that wants to put extra bedrooms, and then a few months later you got refused because of that you got too many bedrooms, you don't have much car parking spaces, you don't have a cycle storage, bin storage. I think those things is to make sure what you can and can't do, because they'll be like, yeah, I managed to get that. There's a trend nowadays when people have outbuildings that be used for non-residential purposes, but they want to make it into residential. That could cause huge problems, and as a majority of time, that could get refused. So I've always say, research into what you can actually achieve within that outbuilding. If you want to convert it into a residential property, you need to look in terms of access, you need to look in terms of privacy, you need to look in terms of the size of the outbuilding, and see whether or not it is compliant. Because sometimes people will just get planning permission for an outbuilding that's not used for sleeping purposes, and then it puts someone to use that into a sleeping purpose, and then the next day the neighbours started to report them to the enforcement officers, and then that's where things got a bit difficult. So I've always put that as a reminder, because when you're providing this such advice, you need to make sure, because sometimes people just do without caution, they don't do without awareness about the consequences of dealing with such issues, such as having an outbuilding. I think everyone's trying to put an outbuilding for sleeping purposes, but you can't. So I've always wanted to make sure that they know the consequences, or they know what's required when it comes to compliance for planning aspects. And for building regulations, making sure that when it comes to fire regulations, making sure the fire escapes is sufficient, and making sure that there is the use of materials, the use of fire stopping, the use of compartmentation, which is used for insulation between the first floor and the second floor, or if you've got a void in the loft space that's not being used, or if you've got a shop on the ground floor. All of those information, making sure it's compliant, because otherwise you won't be able to get the final certification for building control. You won't get the final certification from the fire services. It is something that I really, really want to give that aspect, because otherwise, people will just be ignorant and they will be like, oh, I could not pay much money on this. But I've always had this idea of early engagement with these circumstances in property investment, making sure there's a streamlined design and approved process. Always go something that is simple and short, and making sure the local authority has no issue with these proposals. Minimize the risk involved in terms of compliance, presenting an idea about fire safety regulations, and overcoming issues in terms of access, and if it's a new build, then making sure there's accessibility resources to comply with part, such as a ramp, have a specific wet for doors, or if there's a spatial arrangement in terms of the layout of bedrooms. Because at the end of the day, it does build that long-term value, because when all projects that meet those regulation requirements, they're more likely to attract more buyers and tenants, because there's less risk involved when you buy something. So it will hold their value. It will avoid costly post-production adjustments, meaning they don't want to pay extra costs when they buy the property. They don't want any issues occurring. Hence why there's this trend nowadays when it comes to an architect certificate, making sure the work is being completed under building control approval, And that way it gives you some kind of security for the person buying the property, that if it's a new build, they're making sure that it's everything under control by an architectural point of view. So yeah, it is very important that the idea of compliance from the beginning of the property development project, it is essential, because you're making an investment. You want to make sure there's this early engagement and that early collaboration with any particular professional, making sure that the cost is being fulfilled, making sure the regulation requirements is being fulfilled, and making sure that it leads to smoother approvals, making sure there's no disruptions in the construction process. All of that is all about telling a story of what you're going to do and not do. If you're going to be ignorant to the story, you're going to face the consequences, making sure that you don't trip to those unexpected outcomes from those local authorities or a building control inspector or electrician or a fire safety consultant. So you have to make sure that the overall success to this project is going to be achieved by, with people that understand what they're doing, making sure that you get that early engagement, because early engagement does lead you to being more aware about how much money you're investing into a property. So making sure you're open before you make that decision making. Because sometimes people have to be conscious about how much money they're spending this year, with issues with housing and issues with local authorities having this control over HMO or flat conversions. So yeah, they need to be well aware of what they can and can't do. Have that early engagement with an architect or an architecture technologist or an architect technician on these issues regarding planning approval for HMO. Or I think let's just give you that early awareness and how much money you can actually invest in the next stage. And also in terms of early investment, always consult with a quantity surveyor or a cost consultant. There are some, softwares out there that can help you calculate the costs, or speak with a builder that can actually give you an indication of how much you can actually spend on. So I think that gives you a good indication. It gives you self-assurance, less stress on how much you have to spend, but realistically how much you can actually spend. That gives you give you a yes or no answer to take on to the next stage.
Thank you. And that's really detailed. That's really detailed and so important. So important to get the regulations right and making sure that actually you spend all this money. At the end of it, it gets sign off from the appropriate authorities to make sure it's legally compliant and you can actually use it and get your return on the investment. Obviously, the mortgage companies will be asking the same if you're looking to mortgage something at the end of it. So they'll want to know that things have been signed off correctly. So do you have any resources or tools that you'd recommend to a property investor looking to learn more about architecture, regulation and design? Do you have any basic tools which you would recommend listeners to be more aware of, and perhaps they would want to go and have a little bit of research and look into these resources as well?
Yes, there are some I think would be good to recommend. I think there's a few online platforms. I've always recommend people to look at the planning portal. I know the planning portal is quite difficult to use for some people who are not architects or designers. It does give you an indication of how planning and builder regulations work in this country. It gives you a comprehensive guide to planning permissions or builder control regulations that property investors may need to be aware of when working on developments of properties. It's something that I've always encouraged people to look at. There is a simple guide on, especially when it comes to permitted development or what you can and can't do within Article 4 or within a conservation area. They've made it more easier now, because I think go back 10 years ago, it's quite difficult to navigate through the planning portal, but I think nowadays it's making it more simple for people to read, especially the new rules coming up. So I highly recommend going to your planning portal website. You can type it in Google. I would also recommend, there's this website called the Construction Index. Now, the Construction Index is like a comprehensive online resource offering news, guides, and advice on the UK construction industry. It does cover regulations, suppliers, tools that property investors can actually use for construction-related tasks, because I feel like people may not want to ask a builder that can actually do research online. And I think that's a good website for people to actually look into in terms of, finding ways to navigate through what you can and can't do during construction. In terms of the tools, I think if you could actually look in terms of, I think it depends on the interest of the property investor. If they have an interest in learning more about BIM, you could use BIM on programs such as Autodesk, Revit, or SketchUp. I think unfortunately it's quite costly, but if you can download the demo, use it for 30 days or trial your own use and see how you cope with it, because it helps you to give you an indication to visualize, modify, and analyze building designs in a detailed and accurate way, which can be crucial for understanding compliance and optimizing project costs. It does give you an indication how architects work. I think nowadays people are using those softwares to do such works. So it does give you an indication of how much you are actually invested into it. I think another website that's quite useful and does help me and does help some architects to navigate through ways of property developing is it's called a home building and renovating home building website. It's like a website that offers resources, tools and calculators for those interested in property development, because it does include advice on everything from planning to design to the regulations that impact digital projects. So there's some examples of projects that you can look online. So you can visit homebuilding.com. If I will go back to the Construction Index website, it's called the constructionindex.co.uk. I will share it with you after this podcast episode. I would recommend going and meet with the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, the RICS, and because the RICS offers resources and training specifically for property investors covering builder regulations, property development, sustainability and architecture. They do hold events and workshops, and Chartered Surveyors is highly useful to use one because it can help you to see whether or not, in terms of looking at the current condition of the building, there are some chartered surveyors who can do quantity surveying as well. It is kind of helpful to work with your local chartered surveyor because they are very helpful when it comes to looking at the condition of a particular building, whether it is worthy to invest. They do host events for people who are into the property development. I think they are open to working with anyone, so I highly recommend using RICS. Their website is RICS. There's some online courses as well, like Coursera. And it's like an architecture and urban design courses. It's like offers various online courses related to architecture, urban design and construction. There are some courses that could actually enable you to give you an understanding of planning, building regulations, sustainable design principles, which is the website you can look at. It's called www.coursera.org. And finally, you can actually look at your local authority website in planning. There's residential guidelines and what you can do with HMO or flat conversions, or if you're going to involve an extension or loft conversion, it's always advisable to visit your local authority website, or you visit the government website in terms of useful advice and resources related to construction standards, building regulations and compliance. That's something that you could actually look into. There are some resources online that you can actually look into. If you don't want to talk to an architect, if you don't want to talk to a surveyor, there are websites online, you can even ask AI. You can ask AI questions of what you can and can't do to make sure the information is presented correctly. But there are some information that can help you about what you can do within property investment.
And then, there's some great resources there. Many of them I haven't heard of. I'm going to go check them out myself. But finally, we also ask our guests for a book recommendation. Is there something which you've read or are currently reading which you'd recommend our listeners to read? Or
there's a book that is actually been recommended for a long time, ever since I started university, and it is actually applied to property investors. There's a book called Architecture of Happiness by Alain de Botton. This book offers like an accessible exploration of how the spaces we live in influence our emotions and well-being. It's like an insightful read for property investors, because it emphasizes the importance of thoughtful design, not just for aesthetics, but for creating meaningful and functional spaces that people can truly enjoy. By understanding the connection between architecture and human psychology, property investors can actually develop spaces that are not only profitable, but also valuable in terms of experiences that offer to tenants or buyers. And I always felt that this book gives you an indication about making a home useful for tenants and occupants. This idea of creating a good space for yourself from start to finish every day. And it's good for, I think it's just the way we're living in, how you define your own space and how you be more, making your body more comfortable within that space, how you be more intimate and be more relatable within that space whenever you use the kitchen, the bathroom, the living space. If you're going to implement holistic design approach with Velux windows or implementing better lighting. The book itself I've been reading that book for some time now, and everyone, I think interior designers especially, is a book that everyone loves to read because it gives you a good insight of how you can design a space that could give you some kind of good mood, build up positive spaces. This awareness is like this, this intimacy of building up good quality spaces. You want to sleep well, you want to eat well, you want to interact well, you want to build a legacy for your family, a memorable space as well in terms of how you relate to the materials surrounding you. The book itself is quite useful for anyone who wants to be a very good property investor or property developer that can create spaces that would be beneficial for tenants and for buyers, especially when it comes to mental health, creating spaces that would benefit your mental health. So that book itself has been beneficial for my work in terms of designing spaces internally for the last over 10 years in terms of designing interior architectural spaces for people that want to record memories with family, friends, whatever you do, work, fitness, or whatever activities you're doing inside your own space. You create your own boundary within that space. And I think the book itself is quite useful from a living in spaces. I lived in small spaces, large spaces. I lived in spaces abroad. How people define their space through culture and music, through religion, spirituality, or whatever they define it. It does give you a good indication of who you are and how you can actually improve yourself as a person.
Yeah, it sounds like really quite a diverse book and gives a really good overview about some of the things which we need to be aware of when we are utilising and recreating spaces as property investors.
Yeah.
Ken, just a huge thank you from me.
Thank you.
Loved having you on the podcast today. There's so much detail there. The value you've provided to our listeners has been immense, and I've really enjoyed learning a lot more about you and architecture and how we can implement that as property investors, and also thinking about some of the pitfalls and having open communications come through a lot today. Like I said, just a huge thank you. Thank you for your time.
No worries.
We'll put your details in the show notes, so if anyone wants to get in contact to explore various different projects which they're working on at the moment or looking to work on. Obviously we'll promote your details there. But once again, just a huge thank you from me, and thank you on behalf of our listeners for your time this morning. It's clear that you've got a really great understanding of all the various different challenges which property investors face, and many solutions. You're very solution focused in overcoming those many challenges. So once again, a huge thank you from me.
No worries. Thank you, Roger. Thank you for inviting me over.